It was a quiet, cool evening when the man and his dog walked through the neighborhood. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting their yellow glow over the quiet suburban streets. The man had long since traded his military uniform for the comfortable clothes of someone trying to live a peaceful life. His days in the military were far behind him, but they had shaped him in ways that still lingered in his every step. He walked at a relaxed pace, his dog trotting beside him. The dog, a large, well-trained German shepherd, was more than just a pet. It was his companion, his protector, and his confidant. Together, they had weathered storms and faced countless challenges. Now in retirement, they both sought calmness in the small joys of life, like walks through the neighborhood. The dog's ears perked up occasionally as it scanned their surroundings, ever watchful, as though it knew something was lurking beneath the surface of the quiet world around them. The man's name, which had long since been left behind in the shadows of classified files and military records, was something he didn't share with anyone. He had seen and done things in his past that few could understand, let alone relate to. His time as part of an elite force had taken him to the farthest corners of the world, facing enemies that only existed in whispers. But that life was over. Now all he wanted was peace. As they walked, the dog suddenly stiffened, its muscles taut. The man's eyes narrowed, instinctively alert. It was an odd feeling, something he had known all too well during his years in the service. His military training kicked in without him even thinking about it. He stopped in his tracks and looked around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the dog's sudden change in behavior wasn't something to ignore. That's when he heard it, the faint sound of an approaching car. The vehicle slowly rolled down the street, its headlights cutting through the dimming evening light. The man and his dog stood still, their movements almost synchronized as they observed the car. The dog's tail twitched as its sharp eyes followed the vehicle, as if it could sense something about it. As the car came closer, the man noticed it was an unmarked police vehicle. He relaxed just a little. Perhaps the officers were just patrolling the area. But then something about the way the car slowed down as it approached them didn't sit right with him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The man wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but his instincts told him that something was off. The vehicle came to a slow stop just a few feet away from them. The window rolled down and a voice called out from inside. "Hey, you there!" The man stiffened, his heart rate quickening. It wasn't unusual for officers to stop and ask questions, but something about this felt different. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he was always on alert. His dog, sensing his tension, began to growl softly. The low rumble from the animal was almost a whisper, but it carried a warning in its sound. The officers inside the car didn't seem to notice the dog's reaction at first. They were busy talking among themselves, probably making small talk or checking the area. But then one of them looked out the window and locked eyes with the man. "Everything okay here?" the officer asked, his voice casual but probing. The man nodded slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, just out for a walk with my dog. It's a quiet night." The officer didn't seem entirely convinced, though. His gaze shifted to the dog, still on alert. "That dog seems a little intense," the officer remarked, though the comment was more of an observation than a question. The dog's growl intensified, and the man felt a surge of anxiety in his chest. It wasn't like his dog to act aggressively without a reason. The man quickly placed a hand on the dog's neck, trying to calm it down. "He's just protective. He's trained to be on guard," he explained, hoping to de-escalate the situation. But the officer, his eyes narrowing at the dog, didn't seem entirely reassured. "I don't like the way he's acting. You might want to keep him on a leash." The officer's tone shifted slightly, growing more authoritative. The man felt his stomach twist. It wasn't the first time he had encountered a situation where people misunderstood the nature of his dog. The dog wasn't just a guard dog. It was a highly trained animal with years of experience both on and off the field. The man had used that dog on operations, and it had saved his life more than once. But no one around here knew that. To them, it was just an intimidating-looking dog. "I assure you he's harmless," the man said, trying to remain calm. He wasn't sure what the officer's intentions were, but he didn't want things to escalate. The last thing he wanted was to make a scene. But then, just as he was about to take a step back and resume his walk, the dog's growl turned into a full-on bark. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, and the officers jumped in surprise. In that moment, the officer's hand instinctively reached for his sidearm. It was a quick, almost reflexive movement, and the man noticed it immediately. He was no stranger to tension in the air, but this was different. The officers had become defensive. The dog sensed it too, and it wasn't about to back down. The situation had spiraled into something he hadn't expected, a misunderstanding that could quickly turn dangerous. "Get the dog under control." One of the officers shouted, his voice rising. The man's heart raced. He could see where this was going, and it was a place he didn't want to be. The officers were spooked, and fear was a dangerous thing, especially when it involved people who were armed. The man's mind raced as he considered his options. He couldn't let the situation escalate, but he also knew he had to protect his dog. "I'm going to put him on a leash," the man said, keeping his voice as steady as possible. But before he could even make a move, the officer's finger twitched on the trigger. The shot rang out suddenly, shattering the quiet of the street. Time seemed to slow as the man turned his head in horror. The dog yelped in pain, a sound that tore through his chest like a knife. He watched, helpless, as the dog collapsed to the ground, its body twitching. "No!" The man's voice cracked as he rushed to his dog's side, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt down, cradling the animal's head in his lap, his hands shaking. Blood pooled on the pavement beneath him. It wasn't just a pet. It was a part of him. And now it was gone. The officers stood frozen, their weapons still raised. They had no idea what they had just done. The man's mind raced. His training kicked in, and for a brief moment he thought about what he could do next. But there was nothing he could do for the dog now. The damage was done. The officers seemed to realize their mistake too late. One of them moved forward cautiously, his voice apologetic. But the words didn't reach the man. The man could hardly hear him over the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. I didn't mean for this to happen," the officer stammered. But the man didn't respond. He was beyond words. His dog lay motionless in his arms, and all he could do was stare at it, feeling a deep, hollow emptiness inside. In that moment, the man's mind flashed back to his past. The operations, the missions, the countless lives he had taken in the name of duty, but none of those moments compared to the devastation he felt now. This wasn't a mission. This wasn't some calculated risk. This was a senseless, tragic loss. He held the dog close, the tears coming faster now. He didn't care who saw him. He didn't care what anyone thought. He had lost a part of himself, and there was nothing anyone could say to fix it. The officers, still standing in shock, began to lower their weapons. But the damage had already been done. The man stood up slowly, his grip still tight on his dog's lifeless body. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. There was no going back. He had to make a decision now. He looked at the officers, his eyes cold, and something in him shifted. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The man stood there holding his dog's lifeless body, his thoughts racing as he tried to come to terms with the chaos of what had just happened. His heart felt heavy, as if a part of him had been ripped away. The world around him had gone silent, the officers' voices muffled by the shock and disbelief that gripped him. His dog was gone, and with it something inside him had shattered. The officers, now realizing the severity of their actions, hesitated, unsure of what to say or do. One of them stepped forward, still looking shaken, but the man didn't have the energy to engage. He had no words for them. He didn't care about their apologies or excuses. The damage was irreversible. His dog, his companion, the animal who had been by his side through thick and thin, was gone forever. The silence stretched out, a heavy presence that seemed to loom over them. The man felt the weight of it deep in his chest. He didn't want to look at the officers, didn't want to acknowledge their presence. Instead, he focused on the stillness of the street, the way the world around him seemed to stand still in the aftermath of the tragedy. One of the officers spoke again, this time more gently. "We'll make sure this is handled. We'll get an investigation going." But the words felt hollow. The man didn't need an investigation. He needed his dog back. He needed the life that had just been taken from him. The man turned slowly, his face expressionless. He looked down at the body of his dog one last time, then stood up. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay there. Not now, not with everything still so raw. He started walking away, his steps slow and deliberate. The officers watched him, unsure of how to proceed. They had already made their mistake, and now it was too late. One of them started to approach, but another held him back. "Let him go," the second officer said quietly. "He's had enough." The man walked with a sense of detachment, his mind numb. His thoughts kept flickering back to the dog, to the way it had been so full of life just moments ago and how it was now gone. The bond they shared had been something that couldn't be understood by anyone else. It wasn't just a relationship between a man and his pet. It was a partnership. They had been through too much together for anyone to truly grasp the depth of that connection. He made his way down the street, his steps mechanical, as if his body was moving without his consent. He could feel the eyes of the officers on his back, but he didn't care. Nothing mattered except the aching emptiness that filled him. His dog had been more than just a protector. It had been a friend, a constant presence through all the highs and lows of his life. As he walked, he thought about his past. The missions, the enemies, the chaos. He had spent years in the shadows, fighting battles that few would ever know about, doing things that left scars he would carry for the rest of his life. And now here he was, standing on the edge of a quiet street, mourning the loss of something far more personal than any of the wars he had fought. The man reached his house, but he didn't want to go inside. The thought of the empty house, the quiet rooms where his dog used to roam, felt suffocating. Instead, he went to the backyard where he had always found solace. The air was cool, and the faint sounds of the neighborhood drifted in the background. But the man couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. His dog was gone, and he didn't know how to fill the hole it had left behind. He sat down on the porch, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands hanging loosely between his legs. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but they all circled back to the same place: the dog, the officers, the shot. He could still hear the sound of the gunfire ringing in his ears, could still see his dog's body crumpling to the ground. The image replayed over and over in his mind, each time more painful than the last. The man closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to him like a heavy fog. He couldn't forget what had happened. He couldn't forget the way everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. He had tried to calm the situation, tried to explain that his dog was trained, but the officers hadn't understood. They had acted out of fear, and now the consequences were inescapable. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. It wasn't enough. Nothing felt enough. He knew he needed to make a decision. This wasn't just about his dog anymore, it was about the injustice of what had happened. The officers didn't understand who he was, didn't know the kind of life he had led, but he couldn't just let them walk away from this, not after what they had done. As he sat there, the weight of the situation began to settle on him. He had to act, but how? What could he do that would make this right? The man knew that nothing could bring his dog back, but he wasn't ready to let the officers off without facing the consequences of their actions. He stood up and walked to the shed in the backyard, where he kept his gear. The tools of his old life were still there, packed away, a reminder of the man he used to be. The weapons, the tactical gear, the things he had used to survive in the darkest corners of the world, they were all there, waiting. The man's fingers brushed over them, his mind made up. He would have to go back to that life, at least for a short time. He needed to make sure that the officers understood the gravity of what they had done. He needed to remind them of the man they had just crossed paths with, someone who had lived a life few could imagine, someone who wasn't afraid to make the hard choices. The decision was made, and with it came a sense of resolve. He wasn't going to let this slide. The dog's death couldn't go unpunished. The man wasn't looking for vengeance, he was looking for justice. The two were not the same. He gathered his things in silence, the weight of each movement grounded in purpose. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he could feel the stirrings of something darker building within him. It wasn't rage that propelled him now. It was something far more controlled, far more methodical. He had been trained to handle high-stakes situations, to remain calm and level-headed when everything around him was falling apart, and now it was time to put that training to use once more. The man locked the shed and walked back to the house, his resolve solidifying with every step. He wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let the officers walk away from this without facing the full consequences of their actions. As he entered the house, he felt the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. This was a different kind of mission. It wasn't about fighting foreign enemies or completing covert operations. It was about something more personal, more raw. It was about justice for his dog and for himself. The man knew that the road ahead would be difficult. It would bring him face to face with the truth, with the consequences of the actions he was about to take. But he was ready. This wasn't a mission he could walk away from. Not after what had happened. Not after the loss of everything he had fought to protect. The man walked back into his house feeling the weight of the decision he had just made pressing down on him. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear. He couldn't sit back and let this go. His dog's death had been senseless, and while nothing could bring the animal back, justice had to be served. The officers had no idea who they were dealing with, and the man wasn't about to let them forget. He entered his home and went straight to the small room at the back of the house, the one where he kept his most valuable possessions. It was a quiet room, tucked away from the rest of the house. Here, in the dim light, were the remnants of his old life, the life that most people would never understand. The weapons, the gear, the silent reminders of the missions he had carried out, the dangers he had faced. They were all there, stored with care and precision. The man ran his fingers over the items, his mind already shifting into a different gear. The same calm, controlled mindset that had gotten him through some of the most harrowing moments of his military career began to take hold of him again. He wasn't angry, not yet, but the officers needed to understand the gravity of their actions. They needed to know that there were consequences when you took a life, even if it was the life of a dog. He wasn't out for revenge. Revenge was messy, unorganized. What he wanted was something far more profound: accountability. The officers needed to learn that there was more at stake than just the loss of a life. They needed to learn that their fear had cost him something irreplaceable, and there would be consequences for that. He wasn't going to be reckless, but he was going to make sure they understood the impact of their choices. The man spent the next few hours preparing, moving with the kind of methodical precision that had once been second nature to him. He knew he was entering a dangerous territory now. This wasn't the kind of thing he could simply walk away from. Once he took this step, there was no turning back. But that was a choice he had already made. As he worked, the memories of his dog continued to flood his mind. The animal had been more than just a pet. It had been his partner, his constant companion through the most difficult chapters of his life. The dog had saved him more times than he could count, had always been there, loyal and watchful. They had a bond that went beyond words, beyond simple companionship. They understood each other in ways that no one else ever could. Now that bond was broken, the man knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. The dog's death had irrevocably changed him. He couldn't erase the image of it, his dog lying there, lifeless. It was a wound that would never heal, but there was no time for self-pity. There was work to be done. He couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. The man finished gathering his equipment, double-checking everything one last time. His training kicked in as he ran through the plan in his head. This wouldn't be easy. The officers were still out there, and if he wasn't careful, this could spiral into something far worse. But he was ready. He'd faced far worse odds in his past, and this time he wasn't alone. The memory of his dog. The man moved swiftly, quietly, like a shadow moving through the night. He had no intention of causing harm. He just wanted them to understand. He made his way to the edge of the neighborhood, keeping to the shadows, staying out of sight. He had planned everything meticulously, knowing that the element of surprise was his greatest advantage. If he was going to make them understand, he had to do it without them even knowing he was there until it was too late. As he neared the police station, he stopped for a moment to assess the situation. The night was quiet, the streets empty, as if the world itself had stopped to watch. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of what he was about to do pressing on him. But he had no choice. He couldn't walk away from this. The officers had taken something from him, and now it was time for them to feel the consequences. He continued moving, his steps purposeful and quiet. He knew this area well, had spent enough time studying it to know every corner, every hiding spot. He had been trained to remain undetected, to move in silence. And now, he used those skills to get as close as possible to the station. The building loomed ahead, its lights casting long shadows on the pavement. The man's heart rate quickened, but he remained calm, his breath steady, his body moving with precision. He had done this countless times before, made his way into enemy territory, surrounded by danger, but never allowing fear to take control. He stopped at the corner of the building, pressing himself against the wall, his mind racing with the possibilities. The officers were inside, likely unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. The man checked his gear one last time, making sure everything was in place. He wasn't looking to hurt anyone. He just needed to send a message. A message that what had happened couldn't go unnoticed, that the officers couldn't simply walk away from their mistake without facing consequences. The man surveyed the area, looking for any signs of movement. The station was quiet, too quiet. He wasn't sure if that made things easier or more difficult, but it didn't matter. He had a job to do and nothing would stand in his way. He moved closer, slipping between shadows, making his way toward the back entrance of the station. There, a single officer sat at a desk staring at a computer screen. The man could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the faint sounds of the officer's pen tapping against the desk. The officer seemed absorbed in his work, oblivious to the danger approaching. The man crept closer, his steps light, barely making a sound. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong move and everything could unravel. He reached the door, pressing himself against it just a few feet away from the officer. The man paused, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment. He could hear his breath in his ears, but he forced himself to remain steady. This wasn't just about justice for the dog anymore. This was about making the officers understand the cost of their fear, of their mistakes. He took a deep breath, ready to make his move. But just as he was about to enter, a voice interrupted him. A voice he didn't expect. "Hey, you there?" The officer at the desk turned around, his eyes locking onto the man's shadow. The man froze, his heart racing. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The officer's hand hovered near his radio, and the man knew that if he made the wrong move, this would all spiral out of control. But he didn't move. He stayed still, waiting. This wasn't the time for confrontation. He had to be smart. The officer stared for a moment longer, then turned back to his desk, clearly unsure of what he had seen. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, slowly backing away from the door. This wasn't over, but he knew he needed to find another way. The night wasn't going to end the way he had planned. But that didn't matter. He had sent a message. He had made them feel the pressure. And that was a step in the right direction. The man stepped back into the shadows, his heart still racing from the close call. The officer's sudden movement had nearly shattered everything. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment it seemed as though everything would fall apart. But the man remained still, his mind sharpening even as his body relaxed. He knew better than to make a hasty decision now. This wasn't the time to rush. Patience was key. He retreated quietly, slipping away from the station without making a sound. The night was still, but the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He had expected this to be more straightforward, but he was learning quickly that getting too close could lead to unpredictable consequences. He needed to find another way to make them listen, another way to make them understand. As he walked back through the quiet streets, he couldn't help but replay the moments that had led him here. His dog, the loss still gnawed at him raw and constant. That bond, the life they had shared, it was irreplaceable. The officers hadn't just killed a dog, they had taken away his partner, the one constant in his chaotic world. The man had spent years in dangerous, high-stress situations, but nothing had ever felt as personal as this. His dog had been his connection to a life he could understand, a source of peace in the chaos. The quiet of the neighborhood only deepened his thoughts. The world outside seemed to carry on, unaware of the pain he was carrying, the anger that was quietly building inside him. He had done everything right. He had kept his cool, and yet here he was, still mourning, still angry, still feeling the sting of what had been taken from him. As he walked, he found himself at a crossroads. What now? He had already taken steps that would force the officers to notice, but they hadn't responded the way he'd expected. The confrontation at the station had thrown him off. He had underestimated the possibility that they would still be on alert, that one officer would notice the slightest hint of movement. But now wasn't the time for doubt. The man knew what he had to do. This wasn't about waiting for the perfect opportunity anymore. This was about taking control. He wasn't going to let them ignore what they had done. He couldn't. He made his way back to his house, his thoughts clearer now. The time for stealth was over. He needed to make his presence known. He wasn't going to go to war with the police, but he was going to make sure that what had happened didn't simply disappear into the background, buried by time and forgotten by those who could move on. Inside the house, The man paced for a while, his mind racing. He couldn't rely on subtlety anymore. He had to make his message loud and clear, something they couldn't easily dismiss, but how? He thought of his dog again, the loyalty that animal had shown him, the protection it had offered when everything else was falling apart. The bond between them had been forged through years of service, through countless shared experiences that no one would ever truly understand. And now that was gone. He sat at the kitchen table, his fingers drumming against the wood. What could he do to ensure that this wasn't just another forgotten incident? The officers had taken something precious, something that had been his for years. But what if they didn't see it that way? What if they didn't understand the gravity of what they had done? His mind shifted to the officers themselves, their lives, their roles, their place in the system. They didn't know who he was, what he had done, or the sacrifices he had made. They saw a man with a dog. But what they didn't see was the man who had trained for war, who had faced dangers most could never imagine, and who had always come out on top. They didn't see the man who had operated in the shadows, completing missions that would never be known to the public. They didn't see the man who had lived by a code that transcended anything they could understand. What if they didn't realize just how far he was willing to go to make them understand? The man stood up abruptly, his decision made. It wasn't enough to just be quiet and wait. He needed to make them see him, to make them realize that he wasn't just someone they could forget. He had been underestimated once, and he wasn't about to let it happen again. He grabbed his gear once more, this time with a different purpose. He wasn't going to the station in the same way as before. This time, he would make sure they understood exactly who they had crossed. He wasn't there for violence, but he was prepared for anything. He wasn't afraid to walk the line if it meant getting the message across. The man set out once again, determined and resolute. His footsteps were steady as he moved through the night, his mind focused on the task at hand. He wasn't going to do anything rash, but he was going to make sure the officers understood that he wasn't someone they could ignore. He made his way back toward the police station, this time approaching from a different angle. He wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. He had learned from his previous attempt, and now he was ready to execute his plan with precision. As he neared the station, he paused, looking for the right moment to make his move. He knew he couldn't just walk in and demand attention. He had to make them come to him. The man's training kicked in as he observed the area. He saw the security cameras, the guards at the front entrance, and the officers inside. Every detail was important. He knew what he needed to do. He slipped into an alley near the station, his movements fluid and quiet. He wasn't going to announce his presence. He would remain unseen, operating from the shadows. His eyes scanned the area, analyzing every entrance, every exit. This was no longer about confronting the officers directly. This was about making them aware that he had a presence in their midst, that he wasn't a man they could simply push aside. As the night stretched on, the man continued to observe, waiting for the perfect moment. He could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what was to come. His plan was simple, but it would have the impact he needed. He wasn't looking to start a war, but he was going to make sure that what had happened was not forgotten. The hours passed, and the man's patience grew, but so did his resolve. He wasn't backing down, not now, not after everything he had lost. The man stood in the shadows, his mind running through everything that had led him here. His pulse quickened as he watched the police station from his hiding place. The cool night air brushed against his skin, but there was no sense of relief, no sense of calm. His dog was gone and nothing could change that. But tonight, he was going to make sure that the officers responsible for this tragedy understood the gravity of their actions. He hadn't come this far to back down. His mind was made up and his resolve was unwavering. He wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge was impulsive and chaotic, and he had no time for either. What he needed was justice. He needed the officers to understand the cost of their mistake. The fear, the uncertainty, the confusion that had led them to act too quickly, it had cost him his companion. They couldn't just walk away from this without facing some consequences. The man waited patiently, watching the movements inside the station. The officers were busy at their desks, unaware of the presence just outside their walls. It was a feeling he was all too familiar with, the feeling of being unseen, unnoticed, like a shadow on the edges of the world. But tonight he would change that. Tonight they would see him and they would understand what their actions had cost him. He took a deep breath, adjusting the gear on his back. It was time to move. He slipped from the alley into the small patch of grass behind the station, keeping low to the ground. His steps were light, purposeful. He wasn't trying to be stealthy out of fear, but because he needed to remain in control. He couldn't let his emotions lead him. He had to keep his head clear. The man moved silently, carefully making his way around the back of the station to where the rear entrance was located. There, a single officer stood guard, his attention focused on something far down the street. It was a perfect moment, quiet, almost serene. The man knew he couldn't risk an encounter with the officer, but he also knew that he had to make his move now. He couldn't wait forever. He crouched down, scanning the area for any more signs of movement. Once he was certain, he moved closer, keeping himself hidden behind the corner. His heart beat steadily, and he felt the weight of the situation settle on him. This wasn't just a mission. It wasn't just about getting justice for his dog. It was about making sure that nothing like this would happen again. He wouldn't let this go quietly into the night. Taking one last look, he stepped forward and made his way toward the door. His movements were swift but calculated. He reached the door, pressing his back against the wall. He could hear the low murmur of voices inside the station, the sound of phones ringing, the soft shuffle of paperwork. Everything felt strangely distant, like a world that was both familiar and foreign at the same time. But inside, he knew there were officers who had no idea what they had done. They thought they had handled a situation, that they had acted out of necessity, but they hadn't understood the impact. They hadn't known the true cost of their actions. They had treated a life like a statistic, a simple mistake to be swept under the rug. And that was what the man couldn't allow. His hand hovered near the door handle. The air around him was thick with anticipation. But he didn't rush. He didn't need to. He wasn't trying to cause chaos. He was trying to force them to understand, to make them see him and realize that they had crossed a line. As he pushed open the door and stepped into the station, he immediately noticed the shift in the room. The officers at their desks glanced up, their eyes narrowing slightly at the unfamiliar presence. The man didn't waste any time. He walked with purpose, his gaze steady as he moved through the room. He could feel the tension rise as he approached the officers' desks. The noise of the station faded into the background, and all he could hear was the thudding of his heart in his chest. His mind was still clear, his body calm. This wasn't about aggression. This wasn't about violence. This was about making them understand. The man reached the desk where the officer responsible for his dog's death had been stationed. The officer looked up, surprised, his hand hovering near his radio. But the man didn't need to say a word. His presence spoke for itself. The officer stood up slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to caution. The other officers in the room began to stir, noticing the man's steady, unwavering stance. The man locked eyes with the officer who had taken the shot. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear in the intensity of his gaze. "Who are you?" the officer finally asked, his voice guarded but with a hint of confusion. The man didn't answer. He wasn't there to explain himself. He wasn't there to justify his presence. He was there because they needed to understand. A silence fell over the room, thick with anticipation. The officers watched the man, waiting for him to make a move, to say something, but he remained still. His presence alone was enough to speak volumes. The officer at the desk stepped forward cautiously, his eyes never leaving the man's. "What do you want?" The man took a step closer. His jaw was set, his expression unwavering. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't angry either. He was calm, controlled, and focused. This wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability. "What I want," the man said, his voice steady but carrying weight, "is for you to understand what you've done." The officer's eyes flickered, a brief moment of realization passing over his face. He had acted without thinking, reacting out of fear, but now, standing in front of the man who wasn't just anyone, he understood the seriousness of the situation. His colleagues could sense it too. They could feel the weight of the man's words, and the room grew quieter. The man didn't linger in the moment. He turned, moving toward the exit with the same steady pace he had entered with. He had made his point. They would understand now. The officers would remember this encounter long after he was gone. He hadn't needed to do anything drastic. His presence alone had forced them to acknowledge the gravity of what had happened. As he stepped back into the night, The man didn't look back. He had made sure they knew. He had ensured that his dog's death wouldn't be forgotten, that the officers would carry that lesson with them. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about making sure that what had been taken from him wouldn't be erased. The man walked away, his head held high. He didn't need to hear the officers' apologies. He didn't need them to explain themselves. He had done what he needed to do. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was simply making sure that the right people understood the consequences of their actions. And that was enough.